Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and in this video I'm going to be working my way through the 20 arguments for the existence of God given by Peter Kreeft, the favorite apologist of my Catholic friend who I may have mentioned previously. I haven't done this video before now because I couldn't find the link that he had sent me, but I finally was able to locate it, and so now I've got all 20 arguments at my disposal to look through. Some of these are repeats of the arguments that I've covered in previous videos, so I'll be skipping over those, such as the Kalam cosmological argument and the ontological argument. But I will not be skipping over the arguments in this list that are variations of the arguments that already exist, but are substantially different enough to present some kind of different or interesting response. Many of them follow the same general format of making a unsubstantiated and unsubstantiable universal assertion, and then deducing from that assertion far more than could ever be deduced from it. But nevertheless, I'm going to be working through these arguments instead of responding to them in general, because that will be more satisfying to anyone who hears this video. Before I dive into the arguments that Peter Kreeft gives, I think it might actually be worth reading the introduction that he gives to the chapter on these arguments, because he sets the stage quite well and explains fairly well why both I am an atheist and why many theists are not atheists and why they think these arguments are important. So, to begin, quote, "In this section you will find arguments of many different kinds for the existence of God, and we make to you, the reader, an initial appeal. We realize that many people, both believers and non-believers, doubt that God's existence can be demonstrated or even argued about. You may be one of them. You may, in fact, have a fairly settled view that it cannot be argued about. But no one can reasonably doubt that attention to these arguments has its place in any book on apologetics. For very many have believed that such arguments are possible and that some of them actually work." Quote, "Let's pause here for a moment to appreciate the fact that this author is placing these arguments here and in the way that he places them, not because he thinks they work or are valid, but because they are popular and traditional. This, I think, is an indication of the type of intellectual rigor that we are facing here. Or, well, instead of a type, it is rather an absence. So it is only type if we can call the absence of something a type, which we can't really. To begin quoting again, quote, "They have also believed that an effective rational argument for God's existence is an important first step in opening the mind to the possibility of faith, in clearing some of the roadblocks and rubble that prevent people from taking the idea of divine revelation seriously. And in this they have a real point. Suppose our best and most honest reflection on the nature of things led us to see the material universe as self-sufficient and uncaused, to see its form as the result of random motions devoid of any plan or purpose. Would you then be impressed by reading in an ancient book that there exists a God of love, or that the heavens proclaim his glory? Would you be disposed to take that message seriously? More likely you would excuse yourself from taking seriously anything claimed as a communication from the Creator. As one person put it, I cannot believe that we are children of God, because I cannot believe that there is anything to do the adopting." It is this sort of cramped and constricted horizon that the proofs presented in this chapter are trying to expand. They are attempts to confront us with the radical insufficiency of what is finite and limited, and to open minds to a level of being beyond it. If they succeed in this, and we can say from experience that some of the proofs do succeed with many people. Again, sidebar, interesting to note that what matters to him is that they succeed with people, whether or not they are true, which leaves open the possibility that they succeed with some and fail with others because they are essentially invalid, fallacious, or deceptive, and merely succeed simply because some people can be deceived. So let us dive into these actual arguments. The first one is the argument from change. Basically, he says that We live in a world that changes. Yet, when something comes to be in a certain state, that state itself cannot bring itself into existence. For until it comes to be, it does not exist, and if it does not yet exist, it cannot cause anything. This I will grant. Something which does not exist, including a state of being, which is perhaps a rearrangement of the things that actually exist, nevertheless, as an arrangement, cannot lead to anything else existing. This is my problem with the teleological view that, for instance, Aristotle had in his Metaphysics, where he believed that there was something at the end of a chain of final causes, some final cause that was pulling everything towards it. A view which Plato also held in a more idealistic sense, as we would expect from Plato. Now, Peter Kreeft goes on to say, as for the thing that changes, although it can be what it will become, it is not yet what it will become. It actually exists right now in this state. It will actually exist in that state. But it is not actually in that state now. It only has the potentiality. Now, a question. To explain the change, can we consider the changing thing alone, or must other things be involved? Obviously, other things must be involved. Nothing can give itself what it does not have, and the changing thing cannot have now already what it will come to have then. The result of the change cannot actually exist before the change. This is where I have a problem with this argument. He says that it is obviously the case that something cannot be the actualizer, cannot change itself. But I would contend that inherent in the state, in the definition of the state and the description of the state, so that something is currently in, it might be included the change that it will later have into some other state. For instance, part of the definition and properties of the state of something of radioactive decay is the idea that at some point something will be the same thing will be less radioactive and eventually not radioactive at all. And therefore, inherent in a current state of radioactive activity is the necessary change and decay into something which is not radioactive. Therefore, I would contend that inherent in the state of something can be the tendency to move to another state. Each state that could exist, that an object could exist in, doesn't have to be necessarily stable. He goes on. The changing thing begins with only the potential to change, but it needs to be acted on by other things outside if that potential is to be made actual. I've dealt with a causal version of this argument with the Kalam in another video, so I don't think I need to respond to this. Nothing changes itself. Apparently self-moving things like animal bodies are moved by desire or will, something other than mere molecules. Well, you know what else? We could construct robots that are apparently self-moving, and yet the changes in states that a computer goes through, for instance, may be initially caused, like we might program a computer, but once a computer is programmed, the actual change in states is from within the computer. The computer is changing its own states by the necessity of the kind of state that precedes the state that it is transitioning to. We can see this in animals too. When animals change state in some way, it's because the current state that they inherently requires the next state. Furthermore, this seems to posit the idea that animals have supernatural desires and wills, and that are separate from its molecular construction, which would indicate that animals have a form of a soul, some sort of soul, which I think is somewhat heretical for Christian theology. So I just want to point that out. And when the animal or human dies, the molecules remain, but the body no longer moves because the desire or will is no longer present to move it. Actually, when something dies, it's because the molecular structure of the thing has changed, and that's what makes the state that it ends up in when it dies no longer imply the next state. When something dies, it's because some important component of its physical construction has given out. Initially beginning on the cellular level and then making its way up to the organ level when some organ fails and something dies. Even when it dies of old age, this is what happens. Now, a further question. Are the other things outside the changing thing also changing? Are its movers also moving? If so, all of them stand in need right now of being acted on by other things. Yeah. So he basically says that since the universe is the sum total of all moving things, the whole universe is in the process of change, but then it needs something outside of it to change it. The universe is not merely the sum of all changing things, however. It is also the substrate within which change is possible and within changing things exist, i.e. space-time. As such, perhaps inherent in what space-time is the concept and necessity of change, which I think, since time is the arrow of entropy, or entropy is the arrow of time, is a reasonable conclusion to make. Furthermore, it might be that everything, even if we accept the idea that so the other problem is that for God to create things requires a change within God. For God to do anything or think anything, since thinking is a process of changing thoughts, God requires change himself. Therefore, one would imagine from the arguments given here that God would need something outside of himself to change him, a God's God, so to speak. And the only way that you get out of this is by making God an exception to all of the rules that we've stated above. But there is no reason that God could be an unmoved mover, so to speak, but the singularity itself, which expanded and gave birth to the universe, could not itself be an unmoved mover by the same definition. And from what we know about Big Bang cosmology, that seems fairly likely. I'd also like to point out that we think it's fairly reasonable to say that the net energy, at least I've seen some cosmologists say, and this seems reasonable to me, that the net energy of the universe is actually zero, meaning that, but even if it wasn't, basically everything is a rearrangement of things that existed in the singularity. Nothing new has been created. The universe as we see it now is merely the singularity in a different state. And that state, could be inherently unstable, like, states that we see in the universe now. Plus, again, like with the Kalam, there's no reason to think that whatever applies to everything in the universe has to apply to the universe itself. Moving on. The argument from efficient causality. That's the second argument. We notice that some things cause other things to be. Now ask yourself, are all things caused to exist by other things right now? Suppose they are. That is, suppose there is no uncaused being, no God. Then nothing could exist right now. For remember, on the no God hypothesis, all things need a present cause outside of themselves in order to exist. So right now, all things, including all those things which are causing things to be, need a cause. They can only give being so long as they have been given being. Again, there's no reason to think that there was not something that always existed, which caused everything else, and that doesn't have to be a God. It could be, again, the singularity before the Big Bang. This is just another reiteration of the Kalam, really. Yeah, a possible objection to this is that, if it's, it doesn't even require us to think that, whatever. It doesn't even require us to think that, Okay, so if I say that, you know, it may, when we look at the singularity, because there's no time when the singularity did not exist, because there's no time before the singularity, and it makes sense to think that it would be the initial cause and doesn't require something to cause it to exist. Also, even if we say that nothing existed before the singularity, we have no examples of nothing to inspect in our entire universe. Everything is filled. Even the vacuum of space is, filled with quantum foam and space-time itself, which we are assuming wouldn't exist in a state of nothingness. So perhaps, and this seems somewhat reasonable since nothing is such a strange and almost self-contradictory concept, it seems reasonable to think that maybe nothing is itself an unstable state, and that something has to exist. And saying that something can just pop into existence from nothing would not actually require us to commit to the idea that anything could pop into existence at any time inside our own universe, because there is no nothing inside our own universe. Something's already here, so there's no space for something new to pop into existence. Okay, argument 3, the argument from time and contingency. We notice around us things that come into being and out of being. Whatever comes into being or goes out of being does not have to be. Non-being is a real possibility. Suppose that nothing has to be. That is, that non-being is a real possibility for everything. Then right now, nothing would exist. For if the universe began to exist, then all must trace its origin to some past moment before which there existed literally nothing at all. But from nothing, nothing comes. So the universe could not have begun. But suppose the universe never began, then, for the infinitely long duration of cosmic history, all being had the built-in possibility not to be. But if in an infinite time that possibility was never realized, then it could not have been a real possibility at all. There must exist something which has to exist, which cannot not exist. This sort of being is called necessary. Either this necessity belongs to the thing itself, or it is derived from another. If derived from another, there must ultimately exist a being whose necessity is not derived. That is an absolutely necessary being. This absolutely necessary being is God. So, again, the problem with this argument is that just because something has the possibility, just because it is conceptually possible for everything to not exist at the same... Okay, just because individual things could not exist does not mean that everything altogether could not exist. Just because, even if we ignore the composition fallacy of saying that whatever is true of all of the components of the universe is true of the universe itself, and even if we ignore the fact that this possibility of not existing is something we only see about things that exist inside space-time and not space-time itself, but space-time itself is a component of the universe. Even if we ignore all of that, I would still say that the fact that each individual thing, I guess I'm not ignoring the fallacy of composition, but I'm not just saying it's a fallacy and moving on. Let me explain why it's a fallacy. The fact that each individual thing in the universe could exist or not exist does not mean, ignoring space-time, that everything at the same time could not exist. It is entirely possible that something has to exist, and what exists now is just, what happens to have come around to satisfy that. This is essentially like saying that if I have a random number generator, and it gives me the number 10, I can say, well, for any individual number, for any number that it gave me, it could have been another number. And so that number could not have been returned. And so clearly, for every number, it could have been not returned. And so it's possible that the thing as a whole could have not returned a number at all. But of course, it's a random number generator. It has to return a number. It just doesn't have to return a particular number. Furthermore, so this brings me to agree with actually the premise that there must exist something which, furthermore, just because there's infinite time, doesn't mean that something which is a logical possibility must happen. There has to be some framework in which that thing, that would like make that thing happen, right? So additionally, there isn't infinite time. There's a finite past in time, and there was never a time when the singularity does not exist. So it seems natural to say that, like, even if it didn't have to exist, it's not like it would have to not exist because there was an infinite time when it was just like hanging around before now. I really don't see how this logic follows. Furthermore, if we just grant the idea that there would have to be something that has necessary being in order for anything to exist, why not just, as I've said before, say that the universe must necessarily exist? That doesn't make the universe God. Okay, so the next argument we have is argument from degrees of perfection. I already dealt with this. Now we have the design argument. I'm actually pretty excited with this argument because it actually has a syllogistic form, which I was not able to find when I did my teleological video. So let me cover that here. Premise 1. The universe displays a staggering amount of intelligibility, both within the things we observe and in the way these things relate to others outside themselves. That is to say, the way they exist and coexist displays an intricately beautiful order and regularity that can fill even the most casual observer with wonder. That's a lot of emotive language, and that's all pretty subjective. Sorry. That doesn't really do much for me, but I can see what he's going for. It is the norm in nature for many different beings to work together to produce the same valuable end. Valuable for what? The end itself? Well, yes, of course. The example he gives is the organs in the body work for our life and health. Well, of course, the being that only exists if the organs work together would value the organs working together. This seems like an odd statement. Okay, premise 2. Either this intelligible order is the product of chance or of intelligent design. Premise 3. Not chance. Premise 4. Therefore, the universe is the product of intelligent design. Okay, so, number 1. It doesn't have to, okay, so, why not chance? Well, in answer to that question, Peter Kreeft says, it is, of course, the third premise that is crucial. Ultimately, non-believers tell us, it is indeed by chance and not by any design that the universe of our experience exists the way it does. It just happens to have this order, and the burden of proof is on believers to demonstrate why this could not be so by chance alone. That is actually not the claim that unbelievers make. The claim we make is that it could be chance, it could be of necessity, it could be that the way things work is a necessary property of existence, or a necessary result of the initial conditions of the universe, which could themselves be necessary. We don't know. I mean, and it could be chance. There's no reason why it could not be chance. There's also no reason it could not be this way by necessity. And so we have 3 options: chance, necessity, or intelligent design. And the unbeliever is saying, we have no external evidence outside of this to say it's design. All evidence we have points to either chance or necessity, but you're saying it's design. So provide us with some reasons to select design over chance or necessity. And of course, Peter Kreeft's response. So, of course, Peter Kreeft does not respond to that because he's saying that the unbeliever is explicitly saying it must be chance, which is not what we're saying. We're saying it could be chance, it could be design, and it could be necessity. All the evidence we have points to the idea that a timeless, spaceless, supernatural mind doesn't make sense, and we have no evidence of it existing outside of these arguments. And furthermore, all of the scientific evidence that we've had points to chance or necessity. So we need some reasoning to choose design over the others. But let's see what Peter Kreeft responds to his straw man. But this seems a bit backward. It is surely up to non-believers to produce a credible alternative to design. And chance is simply not credible, for we can understand chance only against a background of order. To say that something happened by chance is to say that it did not turn out as we expected. No, that's not what we mean. Or that it did not turn out in a way we would not have expected. That it did turn out in a way we would have not expected. But expectation is impossible without order. Yeah, this is complete nonsense. Chance can be understood in comparison to order, right? But we have something... Okay, so when we're saying chance, that means that it could have been otherwise. There was nothing that we know of that would have selected this option, but this option is the one we got. I didn't make any appeal to order. Furthermore, even if we were going to make an appeal to order, for chance to be meaningful, we don't need order to actually exist. We only need a concept of order. And once the beginning of the universe has made it the way it is by chance, within it there is order, and so we would have a concept of order that we could compare with the idea of chance, even though ultimately everything came from chance. He tries to criticize Darwinism, and it makes absolutely no goddamn sense. Now we're at the Kalam. We can skip that because I've already covered that. The argument from contingency. If something exists, there must exist what it takes for that thing to exist. The universe, the collection of beings in space and time, exists. So first of all, if we're actually going to discuss the origins of the universe, we have to discuss the origins of space and time. So that's a bit of a problem. Therefore, there must exist what it takes for the universe to exist. What it takes for the universe to exist cannot exist within the universe or be bounded by space and time. Therefore, what it takes for the universe to exist must transcend both space and time. Okay, so there's a sense in which this is true, right? It's literally tautologically true. Whatever the conditions for that the universe requires to exist must hold because the universe exists. But what exactly are those conditions? Are there any? That doesn't seem to be answered to me. Another objection, obviously, to this argument is that there's no reason to think that whatever allows for the universe to exist would be a god. And Peter Kreeft's response is to say that, but the proofs have given us some real knowledge as well. First of all, they haven't. It's literally a tautology that whatever is necessary for the universe to exist exists because the universe exists. But moving on. Knowledge that the universe is created. We don't know that. As far as we can tell, it's always existed for as long as existence makes sense. Knowledge that right now it is kept in being by a cause unbounded by any material limit. I guess you could say that there must be some kind of substrate within which it exists. Maybe. But then that substrate itself must have a substrate and conditions that keep it in existence. So whether that substrate is a god or not, it must have its own substrate within which to exist. So this leads us, to a universe's universe or a god's god, unless we make an arbitrary exception for a base substrate that requires no conditions to exist and provides the conditions for existence, in which case there's no reason to think it is not the universe, since the universe is space and time, and our understanding of what existence is based in space and time. And so it seems that if the universe is the originator and entirety of space and time, then and provides the substrate for what we understand to be existence, why could it not be the arbitrary stopping place that we choose? So the argument from the world as an interacting whole. This argument is quite long, but it basically goes like this. I'll read the whole thing. You know what? It's super verbose, but whatever. Basically, the starting point is the world is given to us as a dynamic, ordered system of many active component elements. Their nature's natural properties are order to interact with each other in stable reciprocal relationships, which we call physical laws. In such an interconnected, interlocking dynamic system, the active nature of each component is defined by its relation with others, and so presupposes the others for its own intelligibility and ability to act. So this is the first problem. Something which exists in isolation could have intelligibility of its own. Perhaps it does not, but he would need to demonstrate that. It would, of course, have no chance to act, but that does not mean it is not intelligible. It all depends on whether you define your ontology based on the action of things or not. Now, personally, I do, so I'm going to continue with the argument, but if you disagree with me and him on this, then you don't even have to go any further. But moving on. Contemporary science reveals to us that our world system is not merely an aggregate of many separate unrelated laws, but rather a tightly interlocking whole where relationship to the whole structures and determines the parts. This is partly true and partly not true. In one sense, the parts interlock because they can interact with each other, but like gravity can interact with electromagnetism, for instance. But electromagnetism is not defined in terms of gravity, nor gravity in terms of electromagnetism, and neither are defined in terms of something else which they have in common. This is why we do not have a theory of everything, and why we seek for a theory of everything. This means that things are not really defined in terms of each other. They can interact with each other, but the laws of magnetism have nothing to do with gravity or special relativity or general relativity in the sense of definition and origin. The parts can no longer be understood apart from the whole. Its influence permeates them all. So again, I disagree with this, as I disagreed with the earlier point. But there is we can move on anyway. Argument. In any such system as the above, like our world, no component, part, or active element can be self-sufficient or self-explanatory. For any part presupposes all the other parts, the whole system already in place, to match its own relational properties. It can't act unless the others are there to reciprocally act with it. So this is the point. This is the crux of the argument, right? In that... So the examples that he gives, which I skipped over in the beginning of the ways in which things interact, are examples of the higher level actions of particles and molecules that are composed of fundamental particles, and the interactions and natural properties of which are epiphenomena of the basic laws that the fundamental particles follow. However, all of the fundamental particles that were ever to exist and eventually produce the higher level particles and molecules and so on that we have now existed together in the singularity. That is what the singularity was, is the compression of all of them into one place, and they existed at the same time. So this does not present a problem for a naturalistic worldview. Nor can the system as a whole explain its own existence, since it is made up of the component parts and is not a separate being on its own independent of them. So neither the parts nor the whole are self-sufficient. Neither can explain the actual existence of this dynamically interactive system. So here he is basically asserting that there must be something outside of anything to explain its existence. This doesn't seem apparently true to me, and obviously he's going to contradict this by saying that God doesn't need a God to create him. From this, he says he can derive three conclusions. Since the parts make sense only within the whole, and neither the whole nor the parts can explain their own existence, then such a system as our world requires a unifying efficient cause to posit it in existence as the unified whole. Again, that's not obvious to me. But moving on. Any such cause must be an intelligent cause, one that brings the system into being according to a unifying idea. For the unity of the whole is what determines and correlates the parts. Hence it must be somehow actually present as an effective organizing factor. But the unity, the wholeness of the whole, transcends any one part, and therefore cannot be contained in any one part. So this does not seem true to me, because a mind can operate on the basis of many principles and ideas and produce things on the basis of all of those different principles and ideas. So, whereas something which does not have a mind acts only on, the one principle that is its nature. And so if everything had to be originated by some unity in order to have a unifying interactive whole, we'd expect that thing to be non-sentient, by this logic at least. Yeah. And then we get the standard, like the mind must be immaterial, eternal, timeless, spaceless, and so on, because it has to be outside of the universe. But again, like, what the hell is a timeless, spaceless mind? That seems contradictory to me. Next, we come to the argument from miracles. Here's the thing about the argument from miracles. Well, let me read it out first. A miracle is an event whose only adequate explanation is the extraordinary and direct intervention of God. There are numerous well-attested miracles. Therefore, there are numerous events whose only adequate explanation is the extraordinary and direct intervention of God. Therefore, God exists. So here's the thing. I disagree, obviously, with the second premise. You see, the thing is that the more we learn about psychology and neurology, the more we realize that the human mind is quite prone to perceiving, to strange glitches that make them perceive inexplicable phenomena, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, the specific phenomena that manifest, so we would expect there to be a lot of reports that people have of strange and inexplicable phenomena, right? And furthermore, we would expect people to use, if they grew up and lived and believe in a system that purports to explain a framework, purports to talk about inexplicable things, and purports to have a framework that explains them. Of course, these people are going to use the only framework, the only language and framework that they have available to them to explain what happened to them. And so, of course, if you're brought up around religion, and you're not, and something inexplicable happens, you're going to try to describe what happened in the terms of your religion. Furthermore, the kind of inexplicable phenomena that people are prone to getting are also the kind that are generally responsive to expectations and prepping and so on. And so if you're part of a religion that says that these inexplicable religious miracles happened in the past, and could still happen now, you're primed to expect that kind of thing. And so when that happens, those expectations will play into what you see. Furthermore, when he says adequate explanation, here's the deal. Just because no specific explanation for the specific event has been given, or even can be given, based on the tiny amount of evidence that we generally have relating to these things, does not mean that it's automatically supernatural. Because, just because we can't come up with an explanation, usually, again, because we don't know enough of the specific details from the time when it happened and the place and so on, doesn't mean that explanation doesn't exist. Just in the same way that, so... Now, what does Peter Kreeft say about this? Obviously, if you believe that some extraordinary event is a miracle, then you believe in divine agency, and you believe that such agency was at work in the event. But the question is, was this event a miracle? If miracles exist, then God must exist. But do miracles exist? Oh, the other thing I wanted to point out is that if the miracles that people perceive are the result of the culture they're growing up in, and their expectations, and the language that they're, and concepts that they're brought up to use to conceptualize these kind of things. And remember that peer pressure and stuff like that can lead to people having these experiences, or group like constantly rehashing experiences can change people's memories over time about the experience that happened, then we would expect to see miracles that are roughly equally well attested from every religion. And sure enough, we do, right? And now a religion can explain the miracles of other religions by saying it's demons or whatever. But the thing is that if that's just a post hoc thing, like, and if that were true, you would expect religious people to have religious experiences from other religions pretty often too, as the demons mess with them, right? But let's say, which events do we choose? In the first place, the event must be extraordinary, but there are many extraordinary things happening that do not qualify as miracles. Why not? First, because they could be caused by something in nature, and second, because the context in which they occur is not religious. Again, if a lot of strange things happen, and most of the world is very religious, we would expect strange things to happen in the context of religion pretty often, even if religions were not true. They qualify as mere oddities, as strange happenings, the sort of thing you might expect to read in Believe It or Not, but never hear about from the pulpit. Suppose that a holy man had stood in the center of Houston and said, "My dear brothers and sisters, you are leading sinful lives. Look at yourselves, drunken, dissolute. God wants you to repent. And as a sign of his displeasure, he's going to shower stones upon you." Then, moments later, thunk, 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 the stones begin to fall. The word miracle might very well spring to mind. Sure, but again, even Peter Kreeft himself admits that this, here, quote, "So, there is not really a proof for miracles. If you see some event as a miracle, then the activity of God is seen in this event. There is a movement of the mind from this event to its proper interpretation as miraculous. And what gives impetus to that movement is not just the event by itself, but the many factors surrounding it which invite or seem to demand such interpretation." He claims that there is massive, reliable testimony to miracles across many times, places, and cultures, but I don't think there is. And okay, so here's the thing: any naturalistic explanation of an occurrence is infinitely more likely than a supernatural explanation, which requires the suspension of all of the laws of reality that we have very high priors to believe are the basis of how reality operates. And just because you can't come up with a specific explanation for a miracle does not mean that there is no such explanation, only that you don't have the data to get to it. Okay, so 10, the argument from consciousness. The argument from consciousness goes like this. We experience the universe as intelligible. This intelligibility means that the universe is graspable by intelligence. No, it does not. He's basically saying that we grasp the things about the universe that are graspable, right? Like, if something about the universe was truly completely incomprehensible to us, it would not be part of, we would not experience it or comprehend the truth of that experience. So, and the fact that we so far have found the universe to be intelligible also doesn't imply that all of the universe must be intelligible. But moving on. Either this intelligible universe and the finite minds so well suited to grasp it are the products of intelligence, or both intelligibility and intelligence are the products of blind chance. So here's the other thing, is that the fact that our minds are suited to understand the universe is really not surprising. Our minds operate by the same rules that the universe operates by, and are developed, evolutionarily speaking, because they grant us an improved ability to operate within the universe, which requires being able, at least to some degree, on the macro level, to grasp the universe, right? So it's not surprising that a mind that is made from universe stuff exists in the universe and is developed in the universe could grasp the universe to some degree. And again, the thing is that I guess I'll talk about my other objections in the next argument. But he says again, not blind chance. Therefore, this intelligible universe and the finite mind so well suited to grasp other products of intelligence. So then he brings up C.S. Lewis's argument against naturalism, which is basically that, as he says, if naturalism is true, then it seems to leave us with no reason for believing it to be true, for all judgments would equally and ultimately be the result of non-rational forces. So here's the deal. The non-rational forces can lead to rational things. That's sort of we know that physical things like neurons and silicon arranged in certain patterns can produce behavior that approximates or is logical, that does logic and so on, right? And from evolution, we have reason to believe that in the case of neuronal structures, they can develop without the interference of a mind, right? So there's no reason to expect that since something is the result of a non-rational process, it can't perceive rational things, right? And there's no guarantee that it will be able to. But, that our minds aren't perfectly rational. They're not always capable of being rational or perceiving things correctly. Our minds are full of cognitive biases that are the exact things that we would expect from a mind that is derived from an evolutionary process that was not directly aimed at producing rational minds. And we invent methods for correcting our own mental errors because we are right just barely often enough, and just barely in the right areas to be able to create error correcting procedures for ourselves, right? Just in the same way that we can use TCP/IP works on top of UDP. To use an analogy that my friend Saeed mentioned, where a process doesn't have to be perfect in order to be right most of the time, because imperfect processes, even ones that are fairly often wrong, can be error correcting. So okay, the argument from truth. This is a transcendental argument. I've dealt with it before. The argument from the origin of the idea of God. This is an argument from Descartes, and it goes like this. We have ideas of many things. These ideas must arise either from ourselves or from things outside us. One of the ideas we have is the idea of God, an infinite, all-perfect being. This idea could not have been caused by ourselves because we know ourselves to be limited and imperfect, and no effect can be greater than its cause. I see no reason why an effect cannot be greater than its cause. There's something called the butterfly effect, right? You can have dominoes that slowly topple bigger and bigger dominoes. You can have a tiny spark causing a gigantic explosion. Furthermore, humans, we know that we're imperfect and limited, but there's a scale along which imperfection and limitation exists. And we could simply have, quite naturally extrapolated out from, not very powerful to that guy over there that's more powerful than me to a maximally powerful being that can just do anything, right? And like a less extreme version of this is Superman, right? Would Descartes argue that it's impossible for us to come up with, the idea of something that Superman has to exist because he's more powerful than we are? and an effect can't be greater than its cause. I mean, a cause can't be greater than, an effect can't be greater than its cause. Therefore, the idea must have been caused by something outside us, which has nothing less than the qualities contained in the idea of God. Again, we can come up with bigger ideas from small things. That's what inspiration is. And, even if we admit that the idea came from outside of us, it could have been from, faulty reasoning and pareidolia and, an overactive agency detector that, sees things that we can't explain and assigns them to something, greater than us that could do those things. And from there, it's just like a race to the top as people top each other's gods. So it's not even worth continuing with this argument. I have already dealt with the moral argument as well. The argument from conscience. So since moral subjectivism is very popular today, the following version of, or twist to, the moral argument should be effective, since it does not presuppose moral objectivism. Modern people often say they believe that there are no universally binding moral obligations, that we must all follow our own private conscience. But that very admission is enough of a premise to prove the existence of God. Isn't it remarkable that no one, even the most consistent subjectivist, believes that it is ever good for anyone to deliberately and knowingly disobey his or her own conscience? Well, they don't believe it's good. They don't believe it's morally bad to not follow your conscience or morally good to follow your conscience. They're just saying that everyone does want to follow their conscience because the definition of conscience is something that makes you feel bad when you do some things and feel good when you do others. And so, obviously no one wants to feel bad. Everyone wants to feel good. So obviously everyone is going to want to follow their conscience. Furthermore, there are ways in which we actually don't follow our conscience, in the sense that sometimes our conscience will intuitively and immediately say to do one thing, but we will hang back and try to assess the situation more fully and rationally, and try to make our actions consistent with the moral judgments that we've made in the past, and consistent with what we are likely to think about morality in the future, so that we don't regret what we do. And so sometimes we actually try to change our conscience to, match things. I've actually been in the process of sort of attempting to change my moral intuitions in order to become a more consistent person, right? Now, where did conscience get such an absolute authority? An authority admitted even by the moral subjectivist and relativist. There are only 4 possibilities. From something less than me, nature. First of all, I see no reason to think that nature is less than me. From me, individual. From others equal to me, society. From something above me, God. So now he's assuming that the moral subjectivist is saying that you are morally obligated to follow your conscience, which is not actually what the moral subjectivist is saying. What they're saying, so the rest of, he steadily eliminates, he basically says, how can I get a moral obligation from nature? How can I get a moral obligation from myself? And how can I get a moral obligation from society? Since nature is less than me, I can't morally obligate myself, because then I could just remove the obligation myself, and everyone else is equal to me in society, so there's no reason that they could obligate me. But again, he's critiquing a straw man of subjectivism. Subjectivism does not say that you are morally obligated for some outside reason to follow your conscience. They are saying that your sense of moral obligation in the first place comes from your conscience. So you're basically, sort of by definition, going to feel like you're morally obligated to follow your conscience. At least to some degree, although it can be overwritten. Furthermore, he says, the only source of absolute moral obligation left is something superior to me. This binds my will morally with rightful demands for complete obedience. I see no reason why something superior to me, no matter how superior or more powerful, gets a right to make moral obligations and commands for me. I see no reason why, in essence, might makes right is the objectively correct framework within which to view things. And Kreeft would have to substantiate this for me to be at all convinced by this argument. I think that, in essence, the only possible place you can get moral obligation is from yourself, because, or from nature, or from. So you can get moral obligation from things around you if you already have built-in moral intuitions, and the things around you manipulate what those intuitions are. But you can ultimately only get moral intuition from yourself. Now, that doesn't make me a complete moral subjectivist, because I think that by necessity, from the kind of creatures that we are, humans necessarily share a set of moral intuitions that is most rewarding for us to follow. And I also think that there are some ways of treating rational actors that are inherently irrational, although that can't motivate all rational actors. It can make us able to label actors as better or worse rational actors. But moving on. Yeah, so this actually appears to be the final argument. Sorry, yeah, it wasn't the final argument. It's just he goes on responding to straw men, and so it was very long and I was fooled. Okay, the argument from desire. Every natural innate desire in us corresponds to some real object that can satisfy that desire. I don't think that's necessarily true. I desire to have a romantic partner, but there's no reason to think that she actually exists. I see. I can desire, all kinds of things, like a lightsaber, for instance, that don't actually exist and can't exist. And the thing is that what someone would respond, what he's going to say or would say in response to that objection is saying, well, those are not natural innate desires. But how do you define what desire is natural or innate? That seems arbitrary, and it seems arbitrary to me to say also that a God is natural, the desire for a God is natural and innate, when, the other desires, for instance, for an ultimate weapon or for a romantic partner, are not natural or innate, when no criteria has been demonstrated to determine what is natural and innate and what is not, and when it seems probably likely to me that those who were never... It also is the case, actually, that there are many people who are brought up without religion and have no desire for a God. So I don't see how it can be innate or natural. Then he goes on to contradict his first premise by saying there exists in us a desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, and no creature can satisfy. Therefore, something must exist more than time, earth, and creatures which can satisfy this desire. This something is what people call God and life with God forever. I simply deny the idea that, simply because something is a natural or innate desire, which he actually does go on to define, and basically an innate desire is one that you would have without, by default, without coming up with it yourself or having the idea of that thing communicated to you. So I, deny that God is actually an innate desire that people have. Simply because people came up with God a lot throughout history, just means not that there's necessarily a desire for God, but, again, there could be other reasons, which I discussed earlier. And I deny the idea that because we have an innate desire for something necessarily means that that it must exist. Yeah. Peter Kreeft attempts to respond to my rejection of the first premise by saying that to reject the idea that we can possibly know that all of our desires, including the one for God, necessarily have a real and extant object to satisfy them, assumes that God must exist in the first place. Otherwise, we could use the desire for God as an example, a counterexample to the first premise. He responds to this objection by saying that this is not really an objection to this argument particularly, but an objection to all deductive syllogisms, in that, like, as an empiricist, one could say that, like, the only proper way to gain knowledge is to generalize. Okay, let me just read what he says. This is not really an objection to the argument from desire only, but to every deductive argument whatsoever, every syllogism. It is the old saw of John Stuart Mill and the nominalists against the syllogism. It presupposes empiricism, that is, that the only way we can ever know anything is by sensing individual things and then generalizing by induction. It excludes deduction because it excludes the knowledge of any universal truths, like our major premise. For nominalists do not believe in the existence of any universals, except one, that all universals are only names. Again, we don't specifically that's not a universal in the same sense as the universals that we rejected. I think the problem with that cheap jab should be quite obvious, so I'm going to move on. This is very easy to refute. We can and do come to knowledge of universal truths, like all humans are mortal, not by sense experience alone, for we can never sense all humans, but through abstracting the common universal essence or nature of humanity from the few specimens we do experience by our senses. We know that all humans are mortal because humanity as such involves mortality. It is the nature of a human being to be mortal. Yes, so basically, all humans are mortal is an a priori true statement because mortality is part of the definition of human. So this is perfectly acceptable from a nominalist position because anything that we came across which was not mortal would not be called human in the sense that we usually mean human. This demonstrates that all humans are mortal because of the definition of what we would call something human based on, right? But this does not save the argument from desire because there is no part of the definition of desire that includes that it is necessary for a desire to be satisfiable. And so there could be desires which we could still call desires based on the common usage and definition, which would nevertheless not be satisfiable. Therefore, it is not an a priori and therefore a priori definitionally true premise. Therefore, you can't deduce universally from it. So yeah, basically, Peter Kreeft continues on giving examples of propositions that we would believe to be universally true, and all of them are a priori analytic. So basically uninteresting, since the first premise of the argument from design is not itself a priori analytic. Okay, so now he's trying to respond to the other thing that I said, which is that suppose I simply deny the minor premise and say that I just don't observe any hidden desire for God. Or infinite joy, or some mysterious X that is more than earth can offer. Reply. This denial might take two forms. First, one might say, although I am not perfectly happy now, yeah. Okay, so my objection to this is that it is possible to never be satisfied completely in your desires without having a desire for something other than anything which is available to satisfy desires. Instead, it could be possible that our desire is just infinitely replenishing instead of for something that is infinitely beyond anything that can satisfy desires. So the fact that I'm never satisfied with, for instance, the amount of money I have or, all the things I've done or whatever, may not be because there's one thing I want to have or do that is beyond all others, and I'm just seeking for that. It could be that, desires just recur and are inherently infinite. There's no one thing that would satisfy the infinite desire. It's just that, something satisfies the desire for a while, and then it comes back again. And I think this is actually quite sensible, because to continue living, you require a continuing desire to do things, to motivate you to continue living, right? And so if something were able to completely satisfy our desires, we wouldn't desire to continue to exist, because that desire would be satisfied. So an important part of continued existence, of life, is dissatisfied desire. Yeah. So, yeah. Yeah. Basically, yeah. So his response is that, here, look. So this denial may take two forms. First, one may say, although I'm not perfectly happy now, I believe I would be if only I had $10 million, a Learjet, and a new mistress every day. The reply to this, of course, try it, you won't like it. It's been tried and has never satisfied. In fact, billions of people have performed and are even now performing trillions of such experiments, desperately seeking the ever-elusive satisfaction they crave. For even if they won the whole world, it would not be enough to fill one human heart. And yet they keep trying, believing that if only next time. This is the stupidest gamble in the world, for it is the only one that consistently has never paid off. It is like, yeah, okay, but that doesn't, it satisfies us for a little while, just not permanently. And so it still is a benefit to try to continue to pursue things, and even the pursuance itself can be a satisfying, at least, and happy thing. Right? So it's not the stupidest gamble. Because something doesn't fully fulfill us doesn't mean it can't partially fulfill us. Also, again, he forgets that the hedonic treadmill is a thing that exists. The fact that our desires are infinite does not mean there must be one infinite thing that can satisfy our desires. Because our desires for particular things are infinite does not mean that we have desire for one particular infinite thing. It could merely mean that, again, hedonic treadmill, right? The argument from aesthetic experience is very short. It just basically goes, there's the music of Johann Sebastian Bach, therefore there must be a God. He basically says, you either see this one or you don't. Well, I don't, so sorry. Then there's the argument from religious experience. He says it's difficult to state this argument deductively, but it might fairly be put this way. Many people of different eras and of widely different cultures claim to have had an experience of the divine. It is inconceivable that so many people could have been so utterly wrong about the nature and content of their own experience. No, it's hardly inconceivable at all. Just because we have an experience doesn't mean we automatically know what the metaphysical component of that experience is. See, he's confusing being wrong about having an experience with being wrong about what that experience is in metaphysical or ontological nature. I don't deny that people had experiences which they described as divine, but that means nothing about what they actually were. Yeah. He says we should take in the consistency of the claims of divine experience, the character of those who made the claims, the effects those experiences had in their own lives and the lives of others. Again, it's possible to have a genuinely edifying experience that had no real basis in reality. This is what people do with drugs. The character, just because someone generally doesn't lie doesn't mean they can't be mistaken. They can also have motivated reasoning, so the character of the people making the claims doesn't really matter. And there's no consistency between the claims of divine experience. That's part of the problem. The common consent argument is, yet again, another version of this. Basically, the argumentum ad populum, if I recall correctly. Basically, the saying, well, there are so many people that believe it that it can't be wrong. So it goes, belief in God, that being to whom reverence and worship are properly due, is common to almost all people of every era. Either the vast majority of people have been wrong about this most profound element of their lives, or they have not. It is most plausible to believe that they have not. Therefore, it is most plausible to believe that God exists. It is actually not most plausible to believe that they have not been wrong. In cases where you're talking about something to which there cannot be good, or to which there's no good evidence either for or against, and there are many competing claims, so there's a vacuum of evidence and many competing claims, it is entirely possible for many people to just choose to believe something and go on believing it, and we wouldn't expect to see like a convergence, especially since bad epistemology is very common. It's actually only been relatively recently, philosophically speaking, that good epistemology and its progeny in science has come around. Furthermore, when something is extremely important to people, that is actually when they are least likely to be rational and methodical about evaluating it. So the fact that religion is the most important component of people's lives is actually an indicator that they would be more likely to be wrong about it. This is why people sometimes say, well, I can't leave religion. It's, too important to me, or God gives me too much happiness, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, the mimetic content of the doctrines of the various religious theologies and the historical accidents and conditions within which they came into existence are more than sufficient to explain their popularity without appealing to their truth. So I don't find this particularly convincing. And then the final argument is, of course, Pascal's wager, which I have an hour-long video responding to anyway, so I don't need to respond to it here. So in conclusion, all of these arguments are extremely weak and unconvincing, and since individually the arguments don't matter, don't work to any degree, they can't also be used as a cumulative case either. A mountain of bad evidence does not good evidence make. It just makes a gish gallop. Additionally, there are many more objections that I could make to these arguments in much more detail, since they often require layering of fallacies and equivocations and false assumptions and strange phrasings. And here I only covered the most pertinent objections to each of these arguments that I could think of on the spot. I invite anyone who believes that these arguments actually work to comment down below, because I'd be interested to hear an attempted defense of any of these arguments. Also, if you believe that you have any actually good evidence of miracles where naturalistic explanations have been explicitly eliminated, and so there just simply not being much evidence to point to a specific naturalistic explanation, also definitely leave a comment below, because I'd be quite interested. But yeah, that's it for today. This was quite a long video, but I think it deserved to be this long.